Okay, I think I'm live. All right, should be on now. So before getting started with this AP US history review, I just want to let you know, I don't know if it comes up in the lighting at all. It seems like this lighting's a little bit dimmer and everything, but I'm incredibly sunburned right now. Went for a long hike today, about 15 miles, and in Wisconsin right now, it's incredibly warm out. I'm sure it was a record high today. It was above 80, and haven't been in that kind of sun for a long time. So on my hike, I wasn't expecting to have so much like exposed area outside of like forest and everything. It ended up being miles and miles of like prairie walking, and the sun was just beating down on me. So like my nose and my forehead up here is like super burnt right now. But anyways, let's see. So a couple of things I want to talk about with this review. I want to focus a bit on the DBQ and the LEQ, and starting out those two things, like how to start them out right. So I put a couple of resources in the information below. Let me. I don't think I can share my screen because I need like an extra piece of software to be able to share my screen on a live stream. But I want to go to the resources below. 1 second. And the first one I'm looking at is, it should say something like thesis and contextualization. Okay, so I'm looking at the context and thesis example, which is in the information below. So I think a lot of people with context and thesis, contextualization in particular, they think they have enough to get the point for it when they probably are short on it. Now, most of the time, 95% of the time, contextualization shows up in the intro paragraph. So the intro paragraph should have both contextualization, and that should be the bulk of the first paragraph, and that should be the first part of it, with the ending being the thesis. So as you'll see in like my example that is at the very top of the video information, in the red of this intro paragraph, it's pretty long there. In the red is all the context, and in the light blue is the thesis. So we just take a look at this prompt. This is just a random prompt. I think I just made it up on the fly. Evaluate the extent to which westward expansion had a positive impact on American society in the 1830 to 1890 time period. Okay, so when we're thinking about that prompt, we got to think about, like, for the context part of it, right, what is going on beforehand? What is going on maybe a little bit before 1830? Maybe going back to like 1800, 1810, 1820s. And then what's going on during that time period as well, 1830s and 1840s, 1850s. And what are some of the things that we can think of that relates to the prompt, but would also help us kind of just set the scene, set what's going on with the prompt itself. So the prompt is about westward expansion. So, manifest destiny and all of its impacts and everything had an immense amount of impacts in 1830, 1890. So a pretty good time period there. So if we take a look in the red at context, and actually, before we go through the context, I want to go down to the teacher's note on the bottom. So on average, only about, I think this is from 2019, only about 30% of DBQs actually get the contextualization point. And if you think about contextualization, that is for both the LEQ and the DBQ. With the LEQ, it's 1/6 of the grade of it. And the DBQ, it's 1/7 of the grade. And so you want to, and I think this is a point you can totally get, but a lot of people attempt it and not many get it. I've been an AP reader for 5 years, and most of the years I was on the DBQ. And I think it's the point that is, for me, just kind of based on the readings I've been at, the point that is attempted the most and not gotten, not achieved. because it's too vague. People have like some kind of like very generic kind of like, there's a lot going on in the world and this and that and everything, but you need some details. So let's take a look in the red on that example. If you just joined me, we're looking at the example that's in the info, in the video information below for the thesis and contextualization. So we got in here, it says, in this time period of 1830 to 1890, American society and economy were going through great changes. Okay, very vague, probably wouldn't get much. And by the way, this is an actual example from one of my students. So, it's a good intro there, but like that alone would not get you contextualization. Let's keep going though. The market revolution in the early part of the time period introduced inventions such as interchangeable parts, the spinning jenny and power loom, and railroads and steamboats. These inventions would lead to a booming cotton economy in the South and burgeoning industrial economy in the North. All right, so we got some good things going on. Of course, part of this time period, the prompt falls within the market revolution of 1800 to 1848. Westward expansion was happening in two phases throughout this time period. The first wave of settlement was the horse-drawn caravans on paths such as the Oregon Trail and Santa Fe Trail. So we started out with the market revolution, and now we're kind of like zeroing in a bit more on like specific trails and specific ways people are getting out west. The second wave was through the new inventions of the railroad and steamboat, which made travel to the new Western territories even easier, such as the first Continental Railroad completed in 1869. Wow, now we're getting really in depth. So you could easily end it by here and get the contextualization, maybe even a little earlier and get the contextualization. But this one, it keeps going. It even talks about the Second Great Awakening, in this example, and the suffrage movement. So we get a variety of things that are happening immediately before the time period of the prompt and during the time period of the prompt. And then if we take a look at the thesis, now there's a lot of different ways to do a thesis statement. There's the popular, I think it's called the John Irish formula, and that one's a little bit complex, but you can even be a bit more direct than that one. The biggest thing about a thesis statement is you don't want to be too vague. You don't want to say, well, there are many social, political, and economic impacts or causes or whatever. Be more specific. And if it's a DBQ, what do the documents tell you? What are like the main ideas of the documents that could help with your argument that maybe you could actually use as main points? But let's take a look at this one. It says, in this setting, westward expansion greatly achieved a positive impact on American society by allowing for American civilization to expand and grow, all right, and for the U.S. to get incredible amounts of valuable natural resources that richen the U.S. Okay, so again, this is just not my own example, just from example from my students, has specific main points, and you could see how the body paragraphs would then go to trying to prove those main points. All right, well, I got a few questions here. All right, first one from Carolyn. How many pieces of evidence should we use for SAQs? So SAQs, all of them are going to have 3 parts. And if you're doing the written exam, you just have that one SAQ section, and that'd be 3 sets of them. So 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, 2C, and then you have a choice for your last ones. If you're doing the online exam, you have even more. You have 5 total, because they swapped out the LEQ for two additional SAQs. So with SAQs, when it comes to evidence, and that's evidence is the key there, because so many SAQs, when they don't reach the point, get a point for an individual part of it, it's because they're lacking specific evidence. So for each, and now it kind of depends on the type of SAQ. So for example, some of those SAQs, you're analyzing primary or secondary sources. And a lot of them, they'll say for the first one, like 1A, they'll say, give the main ideas of both passages, and then for that, you just got to summarize in your own words, like what the main ideas are. But then, for like 1B and 1C, they'll ask something like, okay, give something that supports the author, a specific piece of evidence. Only one piece of evidence, and you just need to explain it well. So you have a specific piece of evidence, it's a piece of legislation, it's an event, it's a historical process, and you explain it well. That's all you need. And then, 1C will ask and give an additional piece of evidence, or it might say, give something that supports the second passage. So it kind of depends on the type of SAQ, but you're always going to want to have one specific piece of evidence when they're asking for it in responding to those. And then you got to clearly explain it. SAQ responses for each subsection, like 1A, 1B, 1C. So like for like a 1A, it should be somewhere around 2 to 3 sentences. Sometimes with SAQs, you can get the point with just one sentence if you have your evidence and you explain it. Usually you're probably going to, have more than one, usually 2 or 3 sentences where you're citing some evidence and explaining it. So for every SAQ set, 1A, 1B, or 1C, you should probably have somewhere in the range of, it depends on the SAQ, of course, but somewhere to like 6 to 8 sentences, probably about 2 or 3 for each one where you're citing evidence and explaining it. Okay. Buddy Roar, will you need evidence if it is asking for the main point of the excerpt? No, you don't. If it's just asking, and you'll probably get 2 of these sets, especially if you're on the online exam, you'll probably get one that's 2 primary sources and another one that's 2 secondary sources, historians. And so if it's a 1A and they're just saying, just give us the main points, that's all you need to do. Just summarize it in your own words. Don't quote it though, but just summarize in your own words. I did shave. Thank you, Shane. Just summarize it in your own words, what it means. I like the poster in the background. Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I'm a huge, so I wasn't a huge Star Wars fan until The Mandalorian came out a couple of years ago. I've seen the movies. I didn't see the sequel trilogy actually until a couple of days ago. But when I started watching The Mandalorian, I was like, wow, this is really good. This is fantastic. And then my daughter, who's turning 7 in a week, she's into it as well. So we watched like all the Clone Wars. Actually, I really enjoyed the Clone Wars. We watched Rebels. I don't know. That's basically been our pandemic thing, is going all through all the Star Wars stuff. And so excited for the Bad Batch coming out on Tuesday. But yeah, let me know if you got other questions. Throw them in the chat and everything. The other thing I want to take a look at though is in the information below. I put in a resource. I think it says HAPP. Sourcing HAPP should say in the video information below. So I'm gonna go to that right now. See, one person's already there. So the other area that a lot of people struggle on DBQs, but I think is a place that if you know how to do it, you can definitely get the point. And that is that HIP or HAP point, the sourcing point, where you have to take 3 sources and extend them a bit further. So I see some folks are on here. So I am in the how to do sourcing using HAP right in the video information below. So I just kind of want to go through this. This is something that, I would encourage you to look over, especially if you're struggling with the HAP points for sourcing. And I just have some examples from them. So, for 3 of those 7 sources, you need to take them one step further, not just using them, and don't quote the documents either. You should be taking the main ideas and using them to support your thesis. But also, how do you use them in a way that you are analyzing the source and at the same time helping to prove your thesis? So I have a few examples here. So the first one, historical situation. And I actually really like historical situation a lot for picking up the HIP point, especially if you have a lot of background knowledge. Like if you get a DBQ prompt, that is something that you're like, wow, I have some outside information. I really know that time period well. The historical situation one is a great one to use with sources. So historical situation, explain what was going on when the author wrote the document. When and where was it written? What had just happened or was happening? Is the document a reaction to some event? So there's some sentences here that might help you. This, whatever document, you like the title of the document, Thomas Paine's Common Sense is related to the revolution, something like that, right? And then bringing it back to where your thesis point is. So let's say you have an example. Let's say you have a document that is about the Boston Tea Party. And you do not have a document that is about the 1773 Tea Act. There's no document about the 1773 Tea Act, but there is a document about the Boston Tea Party. If you bring up the Tea Act as context for the Boston Tea Party, you could get that point. You could, and if this is about, like, let's say the revolution, social changes with the revolution, who knows, any kind of thing with the revolution, right? And you'd probably be talking about the acts and restrictions and all the things that the British did. And you bring up the 1773 Tea Act, and you link it to the Boston Tea Party, and you talk about how it helps prove whatever you're talking about. Well, that's a great way to get one of those 3 points right there. Next one is audience. Audience is my least favorite of the HAPP. As a DBQ reader, it is rare to see people get the point with using audience for it. The reason is because almost every time somebody attempts using audience, it is too vague. They say something like, they have a speech from Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson or whoever, and they say then the audience was the American people. It's too vague, and also it doesn't really help further your argument. So I don't even have like a specific example here. I do have a sentence starter helper that you could take a look at. But my recommendation is to, unless you're really sure of it, is to probably avoid using audience and use the other 3, instead. The next one is purpose. And purpose, I think, can be a great one for a lot of documents to use in the DBQ. So something to think about with purpose is, what type of document is this? Why was the source written? That's a big one right there. What was the reason? So if you think about something like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, well, what is his purpose? His purpose is to, convince the people who are on the fence about the revolution, all the major reasons why they should, break away from Great Britain, right? You can think about what he was trying to accomplish with just kind of going through why was it written. So my example here is, let's say you have an anti-immigrant political cartoon. These might show up anywhere, multiple choice questions, SAQs, or DBQ. So you could say, and it's an anti-immigrant one. So you'd say, as a political cartoon, it had the purpose. And that's another key thing with doing HIP. Use the language of HIP. Say the purpose or audience or point of view. Say that in there. Make it clear to the reader of your essay. Hey, at this point, I'm attempting this HIP point. I'm saying the purpose of this document is this. The point of view is this. Use the language of the standard. So it had the purpose of stoking Americans' fear, who in turn demanded the government reduce or shut off immigration. This proves the xenophobia many Americans had. All right. So in that last part there is bringing it back to your thesis. And the last one is point of view. Point of view can be a little tricky too. Sometimes people are too vague with their point of view. Like they'll say like, yeah, the point of view was an American president. It's too vague. Like it's got to be something, again, that furthers your argument. But just in general, point of view, you got to think about who is the author, what is their role, what biases does the author have because of who they are. So if your source is, let's say, an abolitionist, and it's something about like the cause of slavery, well, all right, well, how are they already looking at the topic? Or if you have a plantation owner, well, what is their background and why does that influence how they look at the topic? So hypothetical DBQ, let's just say we have one about the Gilded Age, and we have a document from a farmer from the populist movement. The populists were a third party that had some success. And they were, against like, they wanted America to get off the gold standard, and they wanted direct election of senators and regulation, or maybe even public ownership of railroads, all that kind of stuff, because those were their big, they mostly represented farmers. So you'd say like the author is a farmer and populist. Okay, so you're giving the person's background. So he will benefit if the United States leaves the gold standard, and this helps prove that there were challenges to the political establishment during the era. And maybe like that would have been like one of your thesis main points, challenges to the political establishment. So again, with HAPP, the big thing is using the language of HAPP and making sure you tie it back to your thesis. It's difficult, but if you get good at it, I think that is definitely a point that is achievable. Let's see if there's any questions here. So I'm horrible at dates. Do they expect us to write dates for every? No, and actually leave dates out. Don't even mention dates. I mean, you can if it's like super pertinent to like what you're discussing, but and even as a DBQ reader, if students get a date wrong when they attempt to, put a specific date on an event, we look at these things as rough drafts, and they are rough drafts. You didn't know the prompt beforehand. You didn't have any idea what might have been the DBQ or the LEQ or on the SAQs. So, I would avoid kind of just using dates. Maybe you can say a general era, like, early 1920s, late 1930s or something like that. If you really need to like kind of identify like the specific time period, but you should kind of be like in the time period of the prompt anyways. And if you do use a date and it's wrong, but your information is correct, like I'm trying to think of something specific here. Like, let's say you're talking about like the New Deal and you try to put in there the exact date when the CCC was created, but you're off by 2 years. The AP reader, one, might not even know the exact date that the CCC was created. So we'll just take whatever you put as your word for it. Two, even if you did get it wrong, the AP reader knows like what the date the CCC was created. They're not going to hold it against you. It could still be used as outside evidence and all those things. So, we're told that at the training, like, hey, these are rough drafts. So, as the word of this year has been, give grace and everything. It's not that big a deal. Or like, let's say the 1890 Sherman antitrust, and you put 1895. No AP reader is going to bat an eye at that. They're going to look at, do you understand what the Sherman antitrust is and its influences and everything? Okay, so Carolyn, which is the best way to set up the intro paragraph of the DBQ? My teacher uses TCL, thesis contextualization, list, points, main body, format, but it's the basic. I teach my students context and then thesis in the intro. I like it like that way. That's most of the DBQs we see at the AP reading too are set up that way. It can be set up the other way. That's fine. Personally, I like the context coming first because you're setting the scene. It's like, for instance, let's say, forget about history for a second. Let's just say you're going to tell your friend a story about, like, let's say in the lunchroom, somebody got into a fight. And you saw your best friend several hours later, and you wanted to tell him or her about it. You would set the scene first, right? Before you get into the details of the fight in the lunchroom, you'd set the scene first. You'd say, it was 5th hour during lunch. I had just finished my peanut butter and jelly sandwich and got done texting, or Snapchatting or something like that. And then you go into what actually happened, right? So most times in our lives, and you don't even realize it, you give context. You come home and you have some big story or big thing to tell your parents. You give some context first. When was the date? What was going on? What was going on around you? So same thing with history. What was going on, and then jump into your argument. You can do it the other way around as well. You can do your thesis and then context after that. That's fine. I just think it makes a little more sense to go context and then thesis. And then what was the rest of yours? So it says list, points, main body, top, list. I'm unsure what you mean by list. I would definitely not do this with a DBQ of just what we call running through the documents. And document 2 says this, and document 4 says this, and you just go right through the documents. That doesn't really help. You might get like 1 out of 2 for the doc usage things, but the documents, your body paragraphs should be linking to your main points of your thesis. So let's say you have 2 main points in your thesis. And they're very, of course, specific, not very vague. They're specific. Your first body paragraph should be linking to your first main point, your second body paragraph to your second main point. If you have a third body paragraph, linking to that. And then where are those documents? So this is why like pre-reading is really important. Analyzing the documents first, figuring out what are the main ideas of the documents and how do they group together? Because those groupings then are your body paragraphs. Okay, how's COVID in your area? Much better than it was before. So in Wisconsin, we had a really rough October, November, December. We had really high rates, but now I just saw almost half our state is vaccinated. So we're really getting really close to 50% vaccinated. I'm vaccinated as well. And now there's very few. They're still lingering around, but hopefully it'll be all done soon. All right. If one of the documents states the audience like FDR addresses to Congress, could you see? I think it's too vague. See, the thing is, let's say your document is the document title, even the title says, FDR's address to Congress. Let's say it says 1941 Pearl Harbor speech on December 8th. And you use intended audience. Intended audience is, the thing is though, is how is that relating back to your thesis? So with the HIPP point, you got to relate it back to your thesis. Wouldn't something like FDR's speech in front of Congress on December 8th, wouldn't that be much better useful, use it as purpose, or the context, you didn't have the strike on Pearl Harbor beforehand. So you bring in that, let's, it's some kind of DBQ about World War II. So that would still be, if all you said was the audience was Congress, it's still too vague, because how does that link back to your argument, Okay, how many pieces of evidence would you use for the LEQ? So technically, with the LEQ, you can get both points with technically just 2 pieces of evidence. I would do more than 2, but technically you can just get it with 2. Both of those, so out of the 6 points, 2 of them are for evidence. The second one is using 2 and explaining it, making it relevant to your argument. And, if you have, let's say, 2 great, one's an event, one's a specific piece of legislation, and you link them back to your argument, and you really explain them, you can get by with literally just 2. I would do more though, just in case. And the biggest thing though is also having the evidence, but explaining it, linking it back to because that's where you get that second point in. How many pieces? Okay, can you use another document as outside evidence? So the outside evidence point is another point where I think a lot of people can pick it up, but not a lot of people actually attempt it. A lot more attempt contextualization and don't pick it up, and not a lot attempt outside evidence on the DBQ. But I think it's a point that is ripe for the taking, because you only need 1 piece of evidence, and it cannot be linked though. It cannot be linked to any of the documents. Let's do a quick example. So let's say you have something about evaluating the extent to which the Vietnam War caused tensions in the United States. And you don't have any document about the Tet Offensive, 1968, the Vietnamese New Year of Tet, and the Viet Cong launch a surprise attack. And back in America, it raises tensions because there's a disconnect between what the generals and the president is telling the people, that the war is going good, that America's going to win the war. But then they see on their TV screens the Tet Offensive, and they see the Viet Cong attacking Saigon and the American embassy, and it looks like chaos. And so that's not in any of the documents, though. The Tet Offensive is in none of the documents. And you have that in your background knowledge. You just only need to use that once. Explain it. You could get it done technically in just a sentence or 2. You probably want to be a little more than that, though. And link it back to your argument. Bam, you got 1 out of the 7 points right there. And you can be confident you got it because you have a specific piece of evidence that's not in any of the documents. You discuss it and relate it back. So many students spend a ton of time worrying about the documents, and you should on a DBQ, but they only count for a maximum of 2 points, and maybe the vast majority of their time is spent just on trying to figure out the documents and how to fit them in, when just a few minutes dedicated to the outside evidence, 4 or 5 minutes of brainstorming if you're really struggling. But for some kids, they'll see the prompt, they'll be like, oh, I have that in my background knowledge. for a very short amount of time, you can pick up what I think is a pretty easy and gettable point on the DBQ that not a lot of students attempt. All right. Let's see. Do you have suggestions for pacing during the SAQs or the essays? So if you're taking the written exam, you just have that one SAQ section, and you'll have your, I think it's usually 40 minutes, and for everyone has to do the first two SAQs, and then you have a choice between the third and the fourth. And I think the time limit on SAQs is actually pretty generous. I think it's not too difficult to get your SAQs done in that amount of time. If you're doing the online exam, the first one being in 2 weeks, that's a little more tricky because the second section, which is usually the DBQ and LEQ lumped together, is now the DBQ and 2 SAQs. And I think you can get those SAQs done. Let's just say you take 15 minutes, and I think most students will get them done in less, in individual SAQ in less than 15 minutes. But let's just say a generous 15 minutes for an SAQ. So you have those 2 SAQs at the end lumped with the DBQ. Right, let's say you get those done in 30 minutes, then you still have over an hour for that DBQ. You have an hour and 10 minutes. So I'd kind of aim for to give yourself 30 minutes on those last 2 SAQs. And maybe if you're really strong on the DBQ and you need more time to brainstorm and plan and think, maybe even less than 30 minutes. Because again, SAQs don't take that long. Okay. Do you have any suggestions? Okay, can I still do well in the DBQ using just 4 documents? Yeah, you can still do well in the DBQ. So, the document usage ones, you have, the 2 out of the 2 points. And a lot of students doing the DBQ, there's a lot of 2 out of 7s. They'll get the thesis statement, and then they'll get 1 out of the 2 docs, even though they use 6 or 7 of the docs. Thing is, with the DBQ, there's always going to be 1 or 2 documents that are very tricky. And, if you just want to focus on outside evidence and contextualization and less on the documents, that might be a good strategy. And just say, look, I'm going to make sure I get 1 of the 2 document points. Now, this might not be a good strategy for everyone, but if you're someone that struggles with using documents, it might be something to think about. You make sure you try to get the outside evidence, the HIPP point, the contextualization, the thesis, get those down for sure. And maybe you don't shoot for that second one because you just struggle with analyzing the docs and everything. All right. And could I get complexity? Yeah, you could get complexity with just 4 docs. Complexity is a really hard one though to assess. I think it's less. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure it's less than 1% of AP test takers actually get complexity. There's a reason why they call it the unicorn point. So few students get it because it's very difficult. There's a lot of different things you could do for complexity, but it's very difficult to get it. And it kind of boils down to this. Is the essay extremely well written? Does the student show nuance in the essay? Do they bring up alternative points of view? And is it very explicit? Like is it something that as an AP reader can easily tell? All right. Could you give any tips on writing or anything? Okay. So Anna, with the context, so we actually just talked about context a whole lot in the beginning of the video. There's a whole helper sheet down there in the video information below that I have about contextualization and thesis and an example there. Biggest thing with context is make sure you have a lot of specifics and you're really doing a good job setting the scene around the topic of the prompt. Could you get, okay, but can you use another doc for the complexity? No, I mean, the complexity is not about how many docs you use. The complexity is just about, did you show this word that is hard to assess? It's hard for me to pinpoint and say, hey, that student showed nuance right there. So a lot of times that's in the eye of the reader. Now I will say this about the DBQ is very few DBQs get a 7 out of 7. It's I'll go through a whole AP reading and read over 1,000 DBQs and maybe have seen 3 7 out of 7s. And the average is actually, a lot of you guys might think this is kind of low. The average is usually somewhere around like upper twos, like 2.7, 2.9. So if you're getting like a 4 out of 7, like let's say you get the thesis down, you get context down, you get 1 out of 2 docs, you get outside evidence, you get 4 out of 7. That's already above average, above the usual, like a 2.7, 2.8 on the DBQ. So like a 4 out of 7 is like above average right there, and setting yourself up for a good overall score. All right. Do they give you a timer? So if you're in person taking the paper test, you'll have proctors, and every school district has a different set of proctors. Mine has volunteers, like parent volunteers from Gifted and Talented, I think, group, and they keep the time. If you're online and on the College Board app and everything, there'll be a timer right there, and it will shut you off whether, once let's say your multiple choice section, 55 questions in 55 minutes, because that's 55, and let's say you got 10 more to go, it will just shut off right there and go on to the next section. So, and you'll see the timer. I really suck at supporting my documents. I always miss 1 or 2 at supporting my documents. So with the support, you got to think of, with documents, the main ideas of the document. Like, again, you get Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So what's his overall main idea? And just put it in your own words quick. Make sure you're not excessively quoting those docs. AP readers, like, when we see the quotes, we just kind of look right past them, and we look for, how are you using it to support your argument? And so, trying to stay away from the quotes, doing things in your own words, and then you'll be all right. SAQs as well. You're going to get some SAQs that are either 2 primary sources or 2 secondary sources, and you're going to get one of those questions that are going to ask you in the SAQ. They're going to say, can you summarize the main ideas of both passages? And don't put a bunch of quotes in there, though. Just put it in your own words. You can use some of the language that they have in there, but overall it should be in your own words where you're summarizing the main ideas. You're going to get that for at least 1 or 2 of the SAQ sets. Okay, I'm going to close this one up in a little bit. I will save it, though, so if anyone wants to watch it later on. But it was great chatting with you guys and answering some of those questions. And good luck on your AP test, all right? Have a good one.